Thank you again to our first panel of speakers for all of your wonderful comments and for helping to continue to expand the conversation. We are now joined by three more folks who are going to add their perspectives to the conversation as well, starting out with James Williams. James Williams, you can check out his biography in the sheet that you all have to learn more about his career, but he has become a friend of Carolina Public Humanities largely through his leadership in the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition, which is doing amazing work to create the space for conversations about painful histories that may include wrongs that are unforgivable, but asking this question of how do we as communities move on from those wrongs together. Next, we will hear from Rosalind Chaplin, who is a professor in the philosophy department and can give us an additional perspective on how this conversation around forgiveness and blame can fit into our understanding of ethics and moral psychology more broadly. And then lastly, we will be joined by Juliane Hammer from the Religious Studies Department here at UNC. And last night we were talking about the different grammars of forgiveness and blame. And religions have played such an enormous role and continue to play such a huge role in shaping a really wildly diverse set of different grammars around these issues. So with that, I will turn it over to James Williams to get us started.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I think as it relates to, some of the concepts and discussion points that Professor Fricker, that is a challenging, Miranda, a couple, I want to use as a jumping off point, shared understanding and accountability, which in terms of my background and my work, I think has been, very important in how I navigate the world. And, I grew up in northeastern North Carolina, a little town called Plymouth. I was born in 1951, obviously during the Jim Crow era. I attended 1st through 8th grade at 4th Street Elementary School, which was the colored school in Plymouth. And in 1965, after I finished 8th grade, that was the year that North Carolina allowed so-called freedom of choice. So, if Black students within Plymouth or Washington County decided to attend the white high school, which was Plymouth High School, they could. And so there were 35 or so Black students, including myself, who attended Plymouth High School. And how this connects to this is that I remember in our history class, we opened the textbook and we're having some discussions. And in the book, there was, I know, some printed language, but also these images, a sort of, happy or contented enslaved people out picking cotton and doing that sort of thing. And there was language about the good or generous, slaveholders and that sort of thing. And so I'm in this classroom with basically, of course, the teacher was white. Practically all the students were white. But there was just something that was so fundamentally wrong that I knew, even though I had not been exposed to any systematic study of American history. I had done a little bit of reading. I had had some conversations with people within my community. And I knew that this was wrong. This was inaccurate. And exactly how I raised that in that class, I don't recall my words. But I do recall saying, there's something, I wanted to say, this is BS. I mean, I'm sure I didn't use profanity, but I did let it be known that this was an inaccurate account of the Black experience in this country. And I mention that to say that, both in terms of the sort of professional work, and in terms of professional work, as an attorney, as a public defender for a number of years, in college, I've always had this sense of the connection between the injustices of our time, the inequities of our time, and this history that has been either untold or falsely told, this narrative that needed to be confronted, that we need to confront. And maybe if we could come to some, quote, shared understanding about that history, then we could make some progress on some of these significant inequities of our time. And so, when I think about that, and I think about some of the, I think, John mentioned the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition, which, sort of, in a nutshell, what we did, we formed the coalition to partner with the Equal Justice Initiative to educate and engage our community about the history of racial terror lynching in Orange County, but not just the history, but also to connect the dots and talk about some of the relics, some of the legacies that we're still trying to address that stem, at least indirectly, from that history. And so, there's a lot more I can say about that, but that's one aspect. But then there are a couple of other efforts that I am engaged in currently, which shed some light on my perspective on this. And one is the killing in 1944 of a private Booker T. Spicely in the city of Durham, in the Walltown neighborhood, which was a black neighborhood in Durham. So here's this private who's stationed at Camp Butler, who's in uniform, who's shot and killed by the white bus driver, Herman Council, because Booker Spicely had expressed reservation to having to move to the last seat of the bus because some white soldiers had gotten on the bus and the driver wanted to make sure that they had a place to sit. And so after expressing his concerns about that, Booker Spicely, even though before he got off the bus, he apologized to the bus driver and said, if I said anything to offend you, I'm sorry. He got off the bus driver got off, shot 2 shots in the chest, shot and killed Booker Spicely, left him bleeding to death, in the gutter, got back on the bus so coolly, and brought back memories of, when I think about that, Derek Chauvin and George Floyd. I mean, just got back on the bus, completed his route, and without going into all the details, eventually he was charged. In 20 minutes, an all-white jury found him not guilty. And so, in thinking about that, and thinking about this question of how can we figure out a way to bring some level of restorative or retrospective or reparative justice in this situation. And so we formed this committee, the Booker T. Spicely Committee, which was a little bit awkward for me because I'm not in Durham. I live in Carver, but I know a lot of people in Durham. So we formed this committee, and long story short, Duke Energy, which was then Duke Power, who owned the bus company, who operated the buses, who defended to the teeth Herman Council and his right to basically lynch Booker Spicely. We said to now Duke Energy, it's time for you to do the right thing. You didn't do it in 1944. You say you are a different entity now. You believe in equity and inclusion and fairness. So put your money where your mouth is. And they did respond, and, scholarships at North Carolina Central's law school, funds for a one-man play by Mike Wiley on Booker Spicely, Symposium at North Carolina Central University on the history of World War II, the Double V campaign and the black military experience, all of that came about because of this interest in confronting our racial past, acknowledging it, and saying that there needs to be some level of accountability. And similar situation with the raid on Graham Street in 1990. I became public defender in Orange County in March of 1990. I hadn't been here a year. When toward the end of 1990, November, I believe, Chapel Hill police, the Chapel Hill town manager, the chief of police, and other judicial officials signed off basically on a raid that would allow law enforcement to target an entire block of the town of Chapel Hill, where they targeted any black person that was out and about on that street with armed weapons, automatic weapons. These officers were dressed in ninja outfits. They had these rifles with the laser beams. They ordered people, and when I say people, I mean black people, because there were a few whites out. They were allowed to go through. They ordered them up against the wall. They ordered them to the ground. It was just an act of racial terror, authorized and at the behest of, the town of Chapel Hill. And so that was 1990, and there really had not been any accountability for that. And so we've begun these conversations and actually have had one public event that led to the town of Chapel Hill issuing a public apology. But there's additional work that needs to be done there. There are victims who are still with us, who suffered that trauma, and they are entitled to something in addition to an apology, even though the apology, I think, is important. So this whole thing of forgiveness. So in doing this work, there are still descendants of Booker Spicely's family that we are working with, and they are extremely appreciative of the work that we're doing regarding their ancestor. How they choose to respond once we have completed our process, because the city of Durham is another entity that will need to atone and reckon with what happened there. I'm not so much concerned about forgiveness, and I'm not going to try to convince the Spicely family to forgive if they choose to do so. I'm fine with that. When I think about blame, and I don't know, I got a minute or two left. When I think about blame, I know from a historical perspective, and that's why I don't get too caught up in whether someone is being blamed for wrongdoing. I know that historically, in this country in a way, blame has been used to justify untold injustices and horrors to my people. Blame was used to justify slavery. Blame was used to justify Jim Crow. Blaming the victims was used to justify racial terror lynching. And so, I think, I think there are different ways of viewing and using blame. I think to the extent that we call attention to these injustices of the past and ask for accountability, it's not so much to blame any person or individual, but it is to say, at least from the work that I'm doing, to those systems that you are responsible, or your predecessors, unless correct this harm or this wrong. Forgiveness also, is an important part of the work that I did as an assistant public defender, because in terms of criminal justice, we have one of the most punitive criminal justice systems in the world, and so we started this movement, a couple of decades ago about second chances and restorative justice and things of that nature. And so when I look at the criminal justice system, I believe, as Brian Stevenson says, that people are better than their worst acts. And so when we're seeking to punish, we need to keep that in mind. This concept of parsimony, for instance, doing the least harm possible in holding people accountable is something that's really important. And I'll just close at this point, but I want to read a paragraph from this book of Margaret Burnham, she's one of my favorite people. She's a law professor at Northeastern Law School, and she's doing this incredible work. If you're not aware of her book, By Hands Now Known, Jim Crow's Legal Executioners, I would commend it to you. And I left my glasses, but I think I can make this out. She says, and this is in one of the concluding chapters, where she's talking about owed what and by whom. And so in this particular paragraph, she's talking about apologies. She says, for the families, apologies are an opening gesture on the path to reparative justice, and they offer a teaching moment for the institutions that extend them. An apology amounts to an official determination that the victim died at the hands of the state, or that the state was in some way culpable. It also constitutes a forward-facing promise, much like the declaration when two people marry. I do hereby declare my intent from this point forward to infuse our relationship with justice and equality. For the state, the apology creates an official record. It is also performative in that it constitutes or is an invitation to constitute a fresh, justice-respecting relationship. Finally, it is imperative in that it compels a new relationship. An apology fosters a practice of redress. It makes clear that, like individuals, institutions will inevitably err and must therefore customarily apologize and make amends for their wrongdoing. Apology must be the norm, not the exception. Not least of the reasons to apologize is to honor those who did not survive the virulence of Jim Crow terror. Their skeletal vestiges, often never properly interred, remain unattended, unmarked, and scattered across history's terrain. Apologies render them visible, urgent, and, despite the passage of time, still morally deserving. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you to the audience for being here, and to the organizers and all the other panelists, and especially to Miranda. So some of my own work is in blame and forgiveness, and I sort of find myself especially interested in these kinds of edge cases, or kind of non-paradigm cases of blame or forgiveness in our interpersonal lives. So I wanted to ask two questions, or kind of make 2 points about these kinds of non-paradigm cases. So the first one I want to raise is about third-party cases of blame. So when you might blame somebody else for something that they've done to somebody else. And then the second kind of thing I'm interested in is in whether or not we can rescind forgiveness or unforgive. And broadly speaking, I'm interested in thinking about whether these cases count as cases where blame and forgiveness can earn their keep, to use our language from yesterday, or whether these are kinds of cases where blame and forgiveness might have gone wrong. So let me start with the third-party blame and forgiveness case. And yesterday we thought a lot about this idea that blame has a point, and its point is to facilitate shared moral understanding. So again, just when I blame my wrongdoer, the thought is part of what I'm trying to do is make them understand they're wrong. And communicate why it was so important to me, and hopefully they will come to feel remorse and appreciate their wrongdoing. And I think this view is super appealing, and one of the reasons, as Miranda has shown, is that it helps us understand why we also need forgiveness. And so the idea is that even if we think that blame is not always a bad thing, because it helps us facilitate shared understanding, still we need a way of dealing with blame once it has achieved its point. And this is what forgiveness does. So Miranda showed us that it allows us a kind of escape from blame once it has fulfilled its purpose of facilitating shared moral understanding. So I really like this view. But I've also sort of long had this conviction that we also face blame and face questions about forgiveness when we're witnessing wrongdoing done to others, especially those we love. And in thinking about the point of blame and this idea of shared moral understanding, I've started to worry a bit about these kinds of third-party blaming cases, and think that maybe they're a little fraught in a way that I haven't fully thought through before. So let me explain what I have in mind here. So suppose that somebody wrongs a close friend of yours. And this actually came up at dinner last night, so I will just use a sort of case like this. So suppose your close friend is seriously wronged by their partner. So I think it can now be a question for you whether you will forgive your friend's wrongdoer. And then this is the point I'm worried about. So it seems to me that in these cases of third-party blame, the point of your blame is not, obviously at least, to facilitate shared understanding about the wrongdoing with the wrongdoer. It seems to me that sometimes the point of your blame in these kinds of cases is just to be a good friend, by showing solidarity or by just sort of sharing an outrage with your friend, communicating to them or reassuring them that you're always there to stand up for them, that kind of thing. And so my first reaction when thinking about these kinds of cases was to think, well, what do they show? They show that blame has plural communicative purposes. So maybe sometimes it communicates something about the wrongdoing to the wrongdoer, and so it is aimed at mutual understanding with the wrongdoer about the wrongdoing. But maybe other times, I thought, it communicates something about solidarity with the victim or the importance of your relationship with the victim. So sometimes maybe it's communication between the third-party blamer and the victim, not between the wrongdoer and anyone else. But then I started worrying that even though these kinds of third-party blaming cases are sort of near and dear to me in my research, the idea of shared moral understanding might be sort of too peripheral to the point of blame in these kinds of cases. And so maybe blame has gone wrong there a little bit. And the reason I had this worry is that I think that sometimes when we blame as third-party witnesses to wrongs done to those we care about, we're so concerned with the victim and we're so concerned with being attuned to them that we can really be quite unconcerned with what's happening with the wrongdoer. So it's just not the kind of case where it feels to me that dialogue with the wrongdoer is most clearly in view. And so again, I think that probably, and I think, I'm not sure if Miranda would be friendly to this point, I think the payoff of this kind of blame might make it earn its keep, even if it doesn't aim at the same kind of shared moral understanding that standard victim blame does. But I have sort of new questions about it, thinking about Miranda's work. Okay, so that was the first thing I was curious about. And then let me shift gears and talk about something else. And I hope it's okay if I summarize a little bit of Miranda's research that we didn't talk through in detail yesterday. So Miranda has argued that we can explain why we think of forgiveness as elective. So as something that the forgiver always has discretion to give or not give. She's argued that we can explain this by understanding forgiveness as literally gift-like. And so the idea is that just like you might think that there are cases where a person really ought to give somebody a gift, they really owe them a gift in some sense, but still the potential recipient of the gift cannot demand it. And if they demanded the gift, it would spoil the symbolic value of the gift as a gift. So the thought is, so too, just in the same way, a person might really owe somebody forgiveness if the wrongdoer has done everything they could reasonably do to apologize. But still, if the wrongdoer demanded forgiveness, it would spoil the very thing they want to get. So it's this really neat way of explaining why forgiveness is always elective. And I find that, I really like that picture a lot. So here's the question, and this is going to draw on some work by another philosopher. So recently, there have been some papers discussing the possibility of unforgiving or rescinding forgiveness. And I'm thinking of the work of Monique Wonderly. So she gives us a case like this. And I'm just going to tell you what her case is. She says, imagine that there are two people in a romantic partnership. Wanda has cheated on Victor. And after a process of repentance and apology, Victor comes to forgive Wanda. But then months or years later, Victor hears Wanda bragging about her earlier infidelity and even plotting a new affair. And so he blames her for two things. He blames her for her new wrongdoing, plotting a new affair, but he also comes to re-inhabit the same blaming attitudes that he had before he forgave her. So it seems like he unforgave her. And there are two questions we can ask about these kinds of cases. The first is whether it's really possible to unforgive if forgiveness is gift-like. And second, if it is possible, and this is to turn to the kinds of questions we've been worried about here, is it ever a good thing for us to unforgive? Is it permissible? Is it justifiable? Does that kind of practice earn its keep? And I don't want to draw any definitive conclusions, but I just thought I would share a few thoughts. So on the one hand, we might think that the gift-like character of forgiveness explains exactly why it's such a big deal to rescind forgiveness. When you give a gift, you should give it thinking that you'll not take it back. Something has to go really wrong for you to take it back. And so too, you might think that's exactly what's happening when we rescind forgiveness. But on the other hand, here's a potential disanalogy. It seems like if you take back a gift, you are taking back what is not rightfully yours anymore. And in contrast, I'm not sure that I see that a person who unforgives is in that kind of a situation. So to return to our little vignette with Victor and Wanda, you might think that Victor retains the right to unforgive. And this made me think that maybe there is some limit on the applicability of the gift-like story to the case of forgiveness. And I'm not sure exactly what turns on this, other than to say that I find Professor Fricker's idea of the normativity of the gift really fruitful, and then this kind of edge case makes me think about how far does the analogy extend. And then one other little comment, I also think it's really interesting to think about the possibility of unforgiving when we think about the cases of proleptic unconditional forgiveness that we had discussed yesterday evening. So, suppose that a person forgives as a way of trying to inspire shared moral understanding when they've realized that blaming is not doing the trick. this is the idea of proleptic unconditional forgiveness. But then suppose the unconditional forgiveness does not work, and there's just no change in the wrongdoer. Even after a long time, maybe. And so it's very clear that it has failed. Does it make sense then to unforgive? On the one hand, I think, maybe so. Like, after all, it seems like what has happened, going with our idea of the gifted character of forgiveness, you have given a gift and the gift has been rejected. That's a way of understanding the failure of unconditional forgiveness if it fails. But at the same time, I'm not sure about that. And I'm not sure that renewed blame could serve a further point. So maybe unforgiving wouldn't ever be called for. These are really just to raise some questions. I don't know that I have a view on that. But I thought that some of the tools that Miranda gave us were really useful in thinking through these cases. And I find these kinds of sort of edge cases super interesting and also quite important in our lives. So I wanted to put them on the table and see what kinds of thoughts Miranda has. Thank you.
Last but not least. So I want to start with gratitude as well. I didn't really know what to expect coming into this, and have found it really generative to think in terms that are not the terms that I usually think in. And so what I want to do is first raise two questions/concerns, and then tell you a little bit about my own research and how that connects to these concepts. So the first concern that I have, or question that I have, is has to do with the universality of the notions of blame and forgiveness. That came up in Sarah's question yesterday as a sort of question of translation or as a conceptual issue. And it strikes me that it is worth naming that especially the notion of forgiveness is both very Euro-American and with that white and very Christian. And the second concern is on a very different scale. So Miranda, in your presentation yesterday, you started with your experiences in Colombia, and then there were a lot of examples that had to do with interpersonal things like lying to a friend. And I will admit that I'm concerned about creating a spectrum that has lying to a friend on one end and genocide and gender-based violence on the other end, and somehow putting them on a moral plane in a conversation. That's not how I think about them. So a little bit about my own work. So I'm a Muslim feminist scholar of Islam who's for the past 20 years focused almost exclusively on gender and sexuality issues in US Muslim communities. The only biographical thing I will say, because it relates to forgiveness, is that I grew up in an atheist family in Germany, so I'm a Muslim convert. And neither in my upbringing nor in my experience as a Muslim over the past 25 years, forgiveness has ever been a relevant concept. And that's interesting to me to think about, because I hadn't thought about it in that way before. The German word for forgiveness is loaded with Christianity. And it is in English, the valence in English is not as sort of open to me, but in German, it's really invested in that. And so as a Muslim, and I share that with other Muslims, we locate the ability to forgive solely in God, not in people. And so we ask God for forgiveness for wrongdoing, regardless of whether that wrongdoing or that mistake or that sin is on the level of interpersonal relations or human-to-human relations that we think of on a sort of horizontal level, or the vertical level that is our relationship with God. So in both of those instances, forgiveness is primarily invested in God as a possibility rather than in other humans necessarily. What we do have, and I think that's relevant here, is a conception of justice, and not one that is produced by God. God sort of sets the parameters for what that justice might be, but it is actually the work and the responsibility of humans to work towards that ideal of justice in human society, right? So like there's a sort of human to human dimension to it. And that justice framework, I think, has been helpful for me in a way that the forgiveness idea doesn't seem to be. So my work has focused on various aspects of gender-based violence in Muslim communities. I don't work so much on the fact that that happens. It happens in all communities. My work focuses on religiously framed efforts against gender-based violence, both domestic violence and now increasingly sexual abuse in Muslim communities. And when I was working on my most recent book on Muslim efforts against domestic violence, forgiveness only showed up in one of the chapters where I write about interreligious work against domestic violence. And I want to mention the Faith Trust Institute, which is an interreligious organization founded by a Catholic scholar that works against gender-based violence in religious communities. And there were extensive conversations in the 90s and 2000s in the Faith Trust Institute community about how to talk about forgiveness, even as a problem in Christian contexts. Along the lines of the forgive and forget, right? So can you pressure victims and survivors to forgive so that they can move on and forget? I look at and work with advocates and service providers who often, that's not unfamiliar, are also survivors. The movement is constituted not exclusively but predominantly of survivors. And of course, some of the work that they do is interested in why domestic violence happens, why gender-based violence happens. And there's an interesting sort of shift that I'm seeing from an older generation that has focused on the individual in terms of reestablishing justice also on communities, but what I'm seeing in a younger generation of advocates is a much more structural approach, a systemic approach to thinking about patriarchy, thinking about capitalism, thinking about racism, thinking in intersectional terms about the ways in which what happens in Muslim families and communities is not so different from what happens in other contexts. And one of the sort of dynamics in activist work seems to me to be the need to meet communities where they're at, in their understanding of structural issues, in their understanding of justice, in the silencing around gender-based violence that also happens in all communities, and then developing a vision of what ought to be. And there's usually a huge discrepancy between where communities are at and where we all would perhaps like to be. I often think about this phrase that they use all the time, that they want to end gender-based violence in Muslim communities. And not to depress you all further, but in the 40 years that we've had legislation around gender-based violence, especially domestic violence, the rates of it in our communities have not gone down at all, right? So the ending is not in sight at all here. I wanna name a way to bring blame into this conversation that has to do with the fact that this work that I'm studying and writing about, and that I'm also actually part of in a participatory way, takes place in a climate of anti-Muslim hostility and racism that suffuses our society. And that means that when domestic or gender-based violence happen in Muslim communities and in Muslim contexts, it gets exceptionalized as a Muslim pathology. And it gets blamed on Islam, and by extension on mostly Muslim men, who are assumed to be exclusively shaped in their attitudes by Islam, right? So Muslims are reduced to their Muslimness as a racialized formation that then explains why that kind of violence happens in Muslim communities. I will not open the Pandora's box of honor killings, but I have written about that as well. That's part of that spectrum, certainly as well. I think somebody brought it up in the conversation already. Maybe Miranda, it was you at some point, who also sort of pointed out that the blame and forgiveness paradigm seems to focus in a very particular way on perpetrators. And a lot of the work that I'm seeing is increasingly attempting to be survivor-centered, thinking about the needs of survivors rather than the possible reformation or moral reformation of the perpetrator. And I think survivor-centered work can be really challenging, in part because survivors have dramatically different needs. And so like things like affirmation, disclosure, what does accountability look like? What does justice look like? Can there be reparations? Like what a survivor needs differs dramatically, and survivors often also don't know what they need, right? Or can't articulate necessarily what they need. I want to say like two more things. There were more because clearly I got really excited about talking about all of this. Muslim advocates use a framework that comes out of mainstream anti-DV efforts, which is the resource roadblock approach that I find really interesting. It's this idea that you can approach a victim's surroundings and look for resources and identify roadblocks to addressing the violence that has happened. And the Muslim advocates use this framework to consider religion, Islam, as either and or a resource or a roadblock. So there are ways to engage with religious ethics, with interpretation, with tools from the religious tradition, from religious texts to say, and the advocates are not unanimous on much of anything. It's a movement, and it's a movement in flux that has burnout and all those things. But what they do agree on is that domestic violence and gender-based violence are wrong, that they're morally wrong, and that God under no circumstances would support that as a project. And then there's sort of interesting variations. I've seen what I describe in the book as protective patriarchy, so an embrace of a patriarchal framework that puts men in charge of protecting women and children, and abusive behavior would be breaking that responsibility or would not attend to that responsibility. And then, of course, there are what I want to carefully call gender justice focused approaches that are sometimes feminist and sometimes not, that blame the patriarchy. That's my own approach, and that was quite complicated in some of these communal settings to actually talk about. And then lastly, I want to think a little bit about justice as in restorative justice. Gender-based violence is inadequately, I personally think by design, addressed in the criminal injustice system. It doesn't actually happen. There is no justice to be found. And James, you brought up restorative justice, and I thought I want to sort of connect with that because I see in some of the younger Muslim advocates sort of references to Black community work on restorative justice and what that might look like. And one of the interesting questions here, I think, is about harm, is about scales of harm, but is also about the intent behind harm. So that's something I would like to talk a little bit more about with everyone, this question of, is there a difference between someone inflicting harm that they weren't aware of being harm, and inflicting harm that no human being could possibly think of as not harming, right? So is an exercise of power, which is what sexual violence most often is, sort of like where in that spectrum of intent does that fall? Okay, I'm gonna stop there. Thanks for giving me 2 extra minutes.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists. And I know we want to make sure to set aside time for questions from the audience, but Miranda, would you like to give some quick responses as well?
Thank you. Yes. I can't possibly do justice to everyone. Same with the other panel. I'll just say a little something. James, thanks so much for all. I need more paper, by the way. Thank you so much for giving us that long view and describing all these incredible projects you're involved in. And I was really interested in your connection with the Equal Justice Initiative and so on. And I think I just want to just offer another thought. So apart from saying thank you, you mentioned, one of the things you mentioned was how extraordinarily punitive the US criminal injustice system is. And I'm a newcomer to this country. I've been here about 6 years and trying to learn and understand where it is that I am and what things mean. And one thing I think can be helpful is comparing with other countries' systems, as you in effect did when you said ours is one of the most punitive in the world. And one thing I read that always sticks with me is that across different cultures and times, and this gives me just general part of the sort of skepticism towards any retributive approach, or at least exclusively retributive approaches to these things. There's quite a lot of agreement about what is a proportionate punishment for a crime at the sort of ordinal level, that pretty much everyone thinks that killing someone is worse than hitting someone, or assaulting someone is worse than stealing something. But there's almost no agreement at all about what is a proper retributive punishment for. Where do you start? What should the scale be? So it's like you could just reduce all of the sentences by 90% and it would be the same. Except if the country, whatever the population is, and including victims of crimes, real victims of real crimes, need to feel that justice has been done, if one's thinking about justice to victims. And that's a social construct. That's a kind of collective, and like, what will we feel is satisfactory? And one thing about purely restorative systems, I don't know if there are any purely restorative systems in the world, but there's many justice systems which have a huge restorative aspect and almost no retributive ethos. In fact, I think maybe quite a few, like the Norwegian system is largely understood in terms of prison being used very sparingly as an opportunity for rehabilitation. So maybe that would be one example. Everyone just has to be brought to see that as justice, and then it will be justice, if you see what I mean. So it's very contingent, is what I'm just trying to say. And I don't know if that's a helpful point. For some reason, I've always found that a very helpful reminder when thinking about retributive systems at all, even if they were well functioning by their own lights, which of course we all know is not the case. And the only other point I just wanted to offer, one of the things that stunned me that I learned about 4 years ago and only recently got to write a little something about, is that in the US, the police are allowed legally to lie to people under interrogation. I mean, this is not normal. This is, in the UK, which has many problems of its own, and indeed this change came about because of terrible miscarriages of justice. That practice, it was in the early 80s, it was outlawed, and there was a shift in police training, a shift towards what's called a PEACE technique. I forget what the acronym is, it's peace, but it basically means, police are meant to be inquiring, investigating. They're not meant to, as a police is standardly trained in the US by the Reid technique, to have an interview, reckon this person's probably guilty, and then switch to interrogation mode, where all police are, if they use the Reid technique, which is very widespread, they're not quite universal in the US, what they are trained, and as it was supposed by their training to do, is presume guilt and seek as much self-incrimination as possible, ideally a confession. And they're allowed to say anything they like at all, legally allowed, it'll stand up in court, to get you to sign. I just find that unbelievably shocking, among a panoply of unbelievably shocking things. But I just really? And I keep talking to Americans who didn't know that it was true. So I'm saying to everyone I meet, don't tell them anything. you can't, and they can say, oh, well, it won't look good if you don't cooperate with us and so on. Total lie. That can't be held against you. They'll say you can, just sign here so you can go home to your parents. Too late. You can never rescind a confession unless you're in the rare case where it's a DNA exoneration after goodness knows how many years in prison. So I just think that's sort of epistemic entrapment. And it amazes me that it's legal. It recently became not legal to lie to children in Illinois, and it was already illegal in Oregon. They're the only two states where police can't lie, even to children, to get them to incriminate themselves. Currently, there's a law in New York State which is going through, being supported. We'll see whether it goes through or not. And it, among other things, insists on the video recording of all interrogations. And I think it actually has an explicit provision about not lying to those who are interrogated. And given that all it takes for them to switch to interrogation mode is reckoning you probably did it, I think you're lying. And everything we know about racism and perception and everything else, that then that legally triggers a legal right to lie and bamboozle you, where being innocent is actually an indicator that you will confess. Let me repeat that. Being innocent is statistically an indicator that you might confess. Why? Because if you're innocent and you're encouraged to think that, it's good if you help us, you waive your right to an attorney and you tell them everything. But you don't know that they're using everything you say, for instance, your location roughly near the scene of the crime at the same time, even though you were having coffee with your friend or doing something else. Now they've got you because you were near at the time. I just find it unbelievable. So I just had to say that, and that's one of the many changes that surely will need to happen. And looking at other countries is helpful because the US is an extraordinary outlier in this regard. Switching like philosophical theory mode, thank you so much. I think maybe I shouldn't try to answer both questions. Thank you so much for both, and I'm thinking about both, but I do need more paper. Perhaps on the, what an interesting question, whether you can rescind a gift and unforgive someone. Maybe I could just say that at least my intuition is surely we can. So one way, and maybe it's a bit unlike other kinds of gifts. So my little argument was that it's helpful to see forgiveness literally as a gift, not to understand it by way of analogy with gift giving, but that it actually is a gift in the following sense, in that its sort of logic follows the normal normativity of a gift, because a gift grabbed or demanded under the idea of an entitlement, like I have a right to this, where in principle, if not in practice, I could take it for myself. A bit like if you legally, if I'm divorced and my former husband owes me, what's it called? Child support in the UK. It's probably got another name here. I have a legal right to extract it. I won't physically go and steal it from him, but it'll be arranged socially. So there's a kind of right to extraction. And if we use the notion of a right in that sense of like per impossibile, in principle, it would be my right to take it, then it's, when you try to take something that's a gift, including if the gift is forgiveness, there's this strange pragmatic self-undermining effect in that, I really want you to forgive me. And I can plead and be very demanding, and that's still okay, because I'm still not adopting this stance of entitlement where in principle I can just take it from you because it's rightfully mine already. If I adopt that stance and I spill out my demandingness or my desperateness for you to give me kind of spills over into this entitlement stance, I could maybe kind of grab it. I could make you say the words, but it falls through my fingertips. It's not the thing I'm longing for. It can't be a gift. And in that sense, forgiveness seems to behave just like a gift. Like when you I think I use the example of marching your ungrateful kids to the shops to demand they buy you that bunch of flowers for your birthday or whatever. Is it like, the saddest bunch of flowers in the world? You can't get gifts that way. So it has this feature of pragmatic self-defeatingness. So I guess I was thinking gifts perhaps as this broad class that displays that normative structure it deteriorates or it is destroyed if it's grabbed or taken under the idea of an entitlement. But maybe, it's really it's really different from other kinds of gift in this respect. If we want to argue that the gift of forgiveness can be taken back, perhaps it's a bit special in that way. And I think given that the gift is the forgiver's commitment to set aside their blame feelings, if we're happy with that broad definition, and if that is done on the basis of a certain understanding of what are the names in the Wonderly case? It's Victor and I've forgotten the unfaithful. Wanda. So Victor forgives Wanda because he's got a certain perception of her attitudes, including her sorriness and then he realizes that perception was wrong. Or maybe she's just changed, but maybe he sees the perception was wrong. So the judgment that grounded the gift of forgiveness turns out to have been false. And that's one rationale for why you think, actually, hey, my resentment, my old blame feelings and some new ones too are on the rise. And that seems to make perfect sense to me. But it's a really interesting idea that maybe that makes it unlike other kinds of gifts. So I think that's what I would like to say about that. And I hope we can talk later about other edge cases and so on, and third-party blame. And Juliane, yes, so one thing, so I certainly, I think of myself as doing ethics and sort of ethical psychology for those for whom it makes sense. That I talked about there being a kind of historical jumble of inheritances, some ancient, some evolutionary, some Christian, and there's a whole cocktail. Now, there'll be many people maybe in this room who don't recognize that cocktail as the cocktail that they live by, and that's just true. And I'm not sure I'm capable of talking about more than one, as it were, moral life world at once, but I presume a non-universal, as it were, set of people who would recognize these patterns as their own. But I think when we often live in societies, we recognize other patterns and are interested in them, even if they're not the ones we live by. And anyone who lives by a particular, I'm not a religious person at all, anyone who lives by a particular set of religious ideas will automatically be in that position if it's kind of secular ethics that's being talked about. So I recognize that. I also did not and would not put interpersonal ethics, like friends, wrongdoing, and so on a continuum with, you said, genocide. I don't do that. And I don't think that blame and forgiving, I don't presume blaming and forgiving are relevant to lots of circumstances. And I think maybe they're hardly relevant to most of the circumstances of historical wrongdoing and so on that have been talked about this morning. And so I'm really interested in the limitations of these sorts of responses. But I talked about the Colombia situation because it's just stunning. The analogy is stunning. And taking all my cues from them. As it happens, my first visit there was at the invitation who are people who are advocates for people who were trying to make public the gender-based violence that they had systematically experienced in their communities. And I use their concepts insofar as I ever talk about them, and they don't talk about survivors, they talk about victims. Survivors is an American word, they don't use that concept. They want to be recognized as victims. So they're still there because the whole nexus of the restorative justice process is this was a crime, we're the victims of the crime, it really happened, it was systematic, and that's their terms. And I think I brought up forgiveness in that connection, in the inverse, that I was surprised, and many of my small contributions around the table were, why are people talking about forgiveness here? Why does it keep defaulting back to this? And it was because many of the victims wanted to think in those terms, as did many of those taking responsibility. But none of the people who'd set up the framework, also Colombian, of course, they had never talked in those terms. So I think of, all these moral attitudes as elective, as it were. What do you find helpful? What do you find natural? How were you brought up? What are the natural concepts for you? And for them, they wanted to say they were victims of a crime, and they didn't talk about blaming so much. They talked about forcing people to take responsibility, in particular forcing the public discourse to recognize what had happened. Truth, 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 truth. They wanted to say what I'm interpreting as shared understanding, but truth is the word they kept using, which all the philosophers around the table kept saying, are you sure you're talking about, are we talking about information or interpretation? No, no, truth. Truth as opposed to lies, right? It's like simple. It's not complicated. It's like, this happened, you know it happens, it needed to be acknowledged. It's like the history that we've heard so much about. These terrible things happen, they need to be acknowledged. It's not truth in a fancy sense. It's just truth as opposed to lies, cover-ups, falsehoods, distortions. And in fact, so my first visit there was at the invitation of those people, victim campaigners, Network for Women Victims and Professionals, they call themselves, because they'd been using my stuff on testimonial injustice, because that is not being believed because of the prejudice against what you're trying to tell people happened. And the prejudices there were, of course, multiple. It's partly sort of misogyny, and given that it was very often women in Indigenous and Black communities who were suffering, there was racist aspect. Poverty, huge aspect about that. This sort of all these different prejudices meant among the elite, among the state organizations, those people didn't matter so much. And don't tell us that they did these things to you. We don't want to know. But people campaigned, and they found supporters in other contexts too, and they've got much of the truth out there, and they were using these ideas of prejudice being used against their word as kind of helpful. And I would never have gone if they hadn't invited me. It was actually quite a strange situation. It's like you're in the Fragmentos monument, and I spoke second after a victim campaigner, Ludilena Perez, who did her talk, and we'd talked beforehand. And then I was like, oh my goodness, I've got to, they asked me to do some philosophy. Oh, really? Is this going to be relevant? But they told me they've been using it, so it was relevant. So I hope, only ever take my cues from them.
Thank you so much. And I know that we are coming to the end of our time here, but I do want to make sure to squeeze in at least one question from the audience. So does anyone have a question they'd like to bring to the panel? All right.
Hi. I was just wondering, in the framework of yesterday's talk about interpersonal blame and forgiveness, how well does that map onto forgiveness, blame and forgiveness between societal groups? In other words, how well does it scale? How accurately can we identify the blameworthy? What about the diachronic generational distances involved in terms of blaming groups, and for how long? Can you address that? I'm not sure there's an easy mapping of one to the other. And my concern is with respect to group blaming, that it's highly inaccurate and sometimes very unfair. Would we blame, for example, today's Jews for deicide? People laugh at that now, but it raises a question. And conversely, should Jews be blaming Christians for not generations, but millennia of humiliation, prejudice, and genocide as well?
Thank you for that. And Miranda, it'd be great to hear your thoughts. I would also throw that out to the panel as well, if anyone would like to jump in on that.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks so much for the question. I think it's a really important question. I feel like, my tools for thinking what I was saying really is a lot about interpersonal wronging. But for excellent reasons, a lot of our discussion is talking about historical and structural crimes and also very severe wrongs. I actually think quite a lot of the things I said yesterday weren't geared even to the worst kinds of interpersonal wronging. It's sort of much more everyday stuff. And then you might build out from there. And then you find the limitations of those moral responses. And in my own view, I think we get to the limitations of those moral responses pretty quickly, which is partly why I was so kind of surprised that in Colombia, for these more collective things, forgiveness was what people really wanted to work with. Whereas in my own sense of things, I I don't really, I mean, they found it helpful, so they must be right, but I would not have anticipated that. And I tend to think that blaming and forgiving is a much more interpersonal thing and for fairly everyday-ish kinds of wrongs. And as soon as you get into like, even interpersonal, like serious assault, let alone terrible historical crimes that are connected with structural injustices, I'm ready to think that the whole blaming and forgiving thing is now out of its depth, and we need other sorts of ways of relating, other sorts of solutions. And so let me just defer to others on this question, but thank you.
So I think I understand your question, but in terms of and piggybacking some on what Miranda just said, when I looked at some of the major harms and wrongs historically, and I say there needs to be a reckoning or an accountability, I'm not foremost thinking about, quote, blame/forgiveness. I am thinking about ownership, acknowledging responsibility, and thinking through what an appropriate remedy might be. And, we can look at a number of historical harms and wrongs. I mean, you think about the Tulsa massacre, the massacre in Wilmington in 1898, even if we start thinking about the question of reparations. So I think people who are pursuing those goals aren't saying to, if we're talking about, classes of people, we aren't saying to white people, you need to pay us reparations. We're talking about, governmental entities, the United States government taking ownership of trying to atone and address for harms that existed over, centuries and certainly decades. And so I don't know that any work that I have been engaged in, other than if we're talking about criminal justice stuff and individual cases, that's one thing. But, in trying to address some of the more systemic harms, we don't usually get into is your fault, is your fault, is your fault, and so you need to address this. We are usually engaging, either governmental bodies at the state or at the local level, or institutions or businesses, for instance. So I don't know whether that helps or not. But you're right. I mean, quite often when we are engaging in these processes, that question that you just raised will be raised in some context like, I've never been an enslaver, or, my grandparents weren't, or my great-great weren't enslavers, and so why should, we have to pay? Well, we're not talking about you paying. We're saying the government should look at how it can respond to this harm. Oh, that's right. I forgot. Yeah, that was you.
It's a symbol. It's a symbol of something. So just to add to that, I think that's really helpful. So I think about it as related to the question of harm that happened in the past, especially in a distant past, and how that's related to structures in the present. So both American chattel slavery and settler colonialism as things that we want to assume don't exist anymore. There is modern day slavery, but not in the same kinds of systems. That happened in the past, and the people who were responsible for it are all dead, doesn't mean that those structures don't still inform the way our societies work today, right? So like there's neocolonialism, there are ways in which Black disenfranchisement in American society is so structurally embedded that like partial reforms or even acknowledging that that happened in the past isn't fixing it. I mean, the civil rights movement was in the 60s. I have my students read the autobiography of Malcolm X often because that makes sense in my classes. And one of the things they always sort of come away with is, so he's critiquing things in the late 50s and early 60s, and this is still happening. Mm-hmm. Right? Maybe there was a moment in the 90s when I wasn't in the US yet where people were like, and we're past it. And the last 10 years have shown us that we're not past any of it. And then the other thing I want to say, also sort of like adding to what James was saying, I think one of my experiences has been with this gender-based violence stuff, that institutions tend to only acknowledge harm when they think they can get away without other consequences. So the institutions are set up to preserve and maintain themselves. The American government isn't gonna admit to that wrongdoing because they're worried about what they will have to do to address it. Because once it has been acknowledged, you can't just take it back, right? And I mean, there are people that are asking for reparations for current Black people in the United States. So I think this sort of reluctance to admit responsibility is often related to the fact that once that admission has been made, something else will have to happen. An apology is usually not enough, and even that doesn't happen half of the time, right? So like Duke Energy is concerned about having to pay something, so and maybe loss of reputation, which is also a financial issue.
Well, this is pointing to one of the many reasons I think that these, you know, even starting from a place of these really small interpersonal conflicts and moments of blame and forgiveness, we can see how this is touching on various cultural, societal, political nerves. And so clearly the conversation is so much bigger than what we can accommodate here today, but I hope that you all keep the conversation going and join me in thanking our panel here. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Lloyd to bring it all home.
Thank you, Joanna. We're coming toward the end of our time, and I had thought we had sort of thought we would close with an open discussion, but we're already having an open discussion. I do want to come back to, I think, a couple of points, and I don't know if should our panel move over here? Panel, you don't have to be, you are now no longer blameworthy in any way. You can sit over here. I think I want to offer a concluding question or query, which I think Juliane kind of posed. There is a long tradition that says forgiveness only comes from God. I think that's a really interesting point. There's another point. Are our conceptions of blame and forgiveness specific to our own culture? And I don't know if people have thoughts about that, but I don't think we can answer that question, but is there something universal about the processes of blame and forgiveness, or are we looking at a particular moment in time and a particular culture? I pose that question, and then as a wrap-up, because we've only got 5 minutes left, I would ask Miranda for your concluding thoughts about this whole experience, what you've learned from this conversation. I mean, has any reflections you have as we come to as we always say in Hegelian sense, the owl of Minerva flies at dusk.
Thank you. Well, I've learned a huge amount, and from every individual I've heard speak. I'm not sure I can sum up what I've learned, but something something that I feel like we've all been exploring and hearing is, I guess I should have mentioned it already. I mean, that in a way, the part of the point of especially taking a sort of functional look at actual practices of moral address, we could say more generally, and I've picked on blaming and forgiving, responses to wrongdoing in an interpersonal frame, is to explore their limits. And it may be that the limits are more interesting and more important than the internal structure of where they do have a natural kind of purposeful use. I suspect that within the interpersonal frame, I suspect some sort of rejecting, maybe retaliatory response to being wronged is very, very basic. And similarly, some way of getting past that is very, very basic. We mentioned the evolutionary aspects yesterday. It doesn't matter whether it's absolutely universal or whatever. We have good reason to suspect there's something pretty deep in human nature of that kind, but that radically underdetermines how they might be realized and played out in culture. And it might be that a culture is geared around I don't want to use the word suppressing, though it's quite tempting, but to, as it were, instantly moving us away from them. Aspects of Buddhist thinking and Stoic thinking are like that. So, as it were, even if some things are in our human nature, it might be that what culture tries to do is move away from it. It would be nice to think that, if violence is deep in human nature, culture tries to move away from it. But as we know, it tends to fail. So I'm interested in the various acculturations and uses in particular times and places, and the limits. And I think it's really useful, perhaps, in thinking about bad things and crimes committed, appalling crimes committed historically, all connected up with ideology and structures of injustice and oppression. Maybe blaming and forgiving are totally irrelevant to any of that. It seems like a lot of people don't find forgiveness irrelevant. I'm not laying down the law for anyone, but I am open to the idea that they're totally irrelevant. And a lot of what I've heard today is much more about the importance of a community, a wider community, and indeed a country knowing its own history. And then, there are some things that happened in history. Pretty hard to have anything more than one interpretation of them once it's agreed what actually happened and who did it. But beyond that, there's going to be disagreements about significance of things and causal connections with things and how to interpret. And as one of my favorite philosophers, Bernard Williams, said, in history, there's more than one truthful story that can be told within a bandwidth. There can be different perspectives. But every activity of history in a country's self-understanding, you've got to agree on what historians call a chronicle. What happened, who, what, where, when. And it can't be done when there's still lots of denials of these things. And it may be that blame encourages denial. And so, and I haven't heard anyone else, as it were, promoting blame. I've heard people saying that what's needed is truth and accountability. And there are many forms of accountability, even in a culture that's quite big on blame and forgiving in some contexts, for these broader political and historical contexts. We did that. My corporation, my country, my state, this happened. Stand up and acknowledge it. And what I've heard is the importance of that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Miranda. And once again, as we often find, history is a very important pathway. To restorative justice, to knowledge, to understanding. That's why actually the Hegelian quote might be appropriate, because looking back, we have to confront it, but then never stick there, never stay there, move on. This symposium has been an example of what we imagined the public humanities to be about, a conversation that helps each of us understand something about our own culture, our own lives. And I want to thank Miranda Fricker for coming into our community and enriching our conversation. Thank you. Thank you very much. As I think Logan said today, I think Maynard Adams would be very pleased with what you've brought to us. I want to thank all of these amazing panelists, Delaney, Ronald, James, Rosalind, Juliane, and Ricky. I want to thank everybody in the room, and I want to thank the Adams Fellows who are carrying the spirit of Maynard Adams somewhere they don't even know they're going with it. So thank you all. We will be continuing with Carolina Public Humanities even after Miranda Fricker goes back to New York. And I think we have a seminar next weekend on the theme of immigration. So thank you all. And we're not going to blame anyone for leaving quickly, but you are forgiven if you must go on to other activities. Thank you for being here.